get started in just a couple of minutes. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to ask them. Okay, let's get started. Today we are doing complete the passage critical reasoning questions. So the main thing with complete the passage is that the correct answer needs to fit with the sentence it's in, and it needs to fit with the passage. So if the passage says something and the sentence starts, however, this can't be the case because blank, it needs to be something that contradicts the beginning of the passage. It has to make a cohesive whole, and it also needs to kind of tie up all the threads. So does it go in the same direction the passage was going? If the sentence is supposed to summarize what the passage is about, does it? Is it logical? Does it like logically make sense with the passage where it's at and given context clues? And then does the answer focus on the whole passage or only a small portion? Typically, answers will kind of cohesively tie up the passage, but if it's very clearly supposed to focus on a specific thing, make sure that it does that. We are going to do a few examples. So I will pull up the first one. I will give you some time to work on it, and then we will see how you feel. Okay. The salt clock method of estimating the age of Earth is based on the fact that rivers are constantly depositing dissolved salts into the oceans. In theory, via determining how long it would take for Earth's rivers to deposit into oceans the amount of salt the oceans currently contain, one could arrive at a somewhat accurate estimate of the age of Earth. However, estimates made via the use of the salt clock method have drastically understated the age of Earth because. So, why why would these methods understate the age of the Earth? We are looking at this method that is supposed to be able to somewhat accurately estimate the age of Earth based on how much salt has been deposited into the oceans, but it consistently understates the age of the Earth, and we need an explanation for that. So let's go through our choices. A. Over time, significant quantities of salt are removed from the oceans as seabeds rise and as ocean spray deposits salt on land. So, if the estimates are consistently understated or drastically understated, then that would only happen if the levels of salt in the ocean were lower than they should be according to this method. And we know that rivers are constantly depositing dissolved salts into the oceans. So there's probably there's no way for them to be lower if we have an idea of constant salt deposits, except for that someone's removing some salt or there's something happened to take some salt out of the oceans, in this case, salt spray, and I guess just seabed rise and fall residue of salt. So A would explain how the salt clock method drastically understates the age of Earth. B, the rate at which rivers deposit salt into the oceans has not been constant. Notice that this doesn't require a constant rate of deposit. It could be general trends. We don't know enough about the salt clock method to think that that is an issue. And it definitely doesn't say anything about understating versus overstating. C, in estimating Earth's age, those using the salt clock method rely on the unproven assumption that initially ocean water contained virtually no salt. If we're assuming that the ocean contains no salt and we're still drastically understating the age of Earth, then if its surprise did contain some amount of salt, that would make the estimates longer. That would make it more likely to overstate the age of Earth. D, along with rivers depositing salts into the oceans, rain causes airborne salt particles to fall into the oceans and dissolve. Similar with C, that's just more reason for salt to be in the ocean. So that wouldn't lead to an understatement. It would lead, if anything, to an overstatement. And E, the levels of dissolved salts are not the same in all locations in Earth's oceans. That is also not required. There's nothing in the passage that suggests that they're sampling lots of different ocean areas and basing it on the consistency or something. So again, consistency isn't necessarily required for the method to work from what we know. So A is the only reason I see that there would be an understatement. Any questions about that? Okay. Let's look at our next one. This one is a two-part analysis, so and I think that'll let you put in your short answer. Okay. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a vital role in motivation and reward. High levels of engagement, particularly engaging in enjoyable activities, can increase dopamine levels. Some dopamine production is triggered by offline activities such as exercise and social interaction. However, the use of smartphone apps results in unusually strong dopamine production. These apps are designed to be highly engaging and habit forming and often involve reward mechanisms such as likes, shares, comments, points, or levels. A recent study found that the more time participants spent on smartphone apps before engaging in offline activities, the less time they spent on the offline activities. This result suggests that an increase in the blank one can lead to a decrease in the blank two. So, dopamine is this neurotransmitter, and high levels of engagement or engaging in enjoyable activities can increase dopamine. Some dopamine is triggered by offline activities like exercise and social interaction. However, phone apps result in an unusually high dopamine production. Apps are designed to be engaging and habit forming. So, a recent study found that increased time spent on apps led to decreased time spent on offline activities. What would this suggest? This result suggests that an increase in the blank can lead to a decrease in the blank. So what could we increase to decrease something else here? So choice one, amount of time doing enjoyable activities. All of these activities are enjoyable. Exercise, social interaction, and the smartphone apps are all ostensibly enjoyable, and that is why they increase dopamine levels. So that's not really a good breaking point. B, strength of a person's habits. Strengths of habits isn't really discussed here. Um, they talk about how smartphone apps can be a little bit addictive, habit forming, but strength of a person's habits is just not in scope at all. Increase in amount of time spent on activities that produce a weaker dopamine response. That one doesn't really work for this blank because there's nothing in the passage that suggests that anyone spending more time on activities that produce a weaker dopamine response, only that they will sometimes spend less time on activities that produce a weaker dopamine response. The ability to focus on important projects. There is no important project mentioned here, so that's more of a real world trap. And the amount of time spent on smartphone apps. So in this last sentence, it says a recent study found that the more time participants spent on smartphone apps before engaging in offline activities, the less time they spent on the offline activities. So it would make sense that that result suggests that an increase in the amount of time spent on smartphone apps can lead to a decrease in the amount of time spent on activities that produce a weaker dopamine response, which would just be like a regular level of dopamine response instead of the unusually strong dopamine production that you get from the smartphone apps. So I would say for one, E, and for two, C. That one doesn't really show me your answers, but if you have any questions about that, let me know. Why not E, B? Because we don't know anything about the strengths of a person's habits. I guess you could spin a story about how someone that used to exercise and social interact more before they started using a smartphone app might decrease their habit on that, but it's not really supported by the text. Habits, strength of habits gets a little too far out of scope. Any other questions? All right, here is our next example. Okay. The number of years that a person spends in school is negatively correlated with the likelihood of that person's becoming involved in criminal activity. Therefore, some people have called for increased focus on use of education as a tool for reducing crime. Others have raised the issue of the possibility that the reason for the observed correlation is not that, in general, education reduces a person's likelihood of becoming involved in crime, but rather that in general, people who are relatively more motivated to pursue education are relatively less motivated to become involved in crime. Studies have provided reason to discount this possibility, however, as they have found that blank. Okay, this is the possibility that we are looking for a reason to discount. The rest is really just set up. So, um, in general, people who are relatively more motivated to pursue education are relatively less motivated to become involved in crime. What might suggest that that is not true? A, people who complete high school are less likely to become involved in crime than those who quit before they graduate. That is just the first sentence restated, that there's a negative correlation with the likelihood of, or the number of years that a person spends in school is negatively correlated with the likelihood of that person becoming involved in criminal activity. That's basically what A is saying. B, some people who have spent many years in school are no more educated than others who have spent relatively few years in school. If you've ever been here before, you know that any example about some people I'm pretty dubious of, but also this answer just seems like it's splitting hairs about what qualifies as educated, but the setup is very much about the number of years that a person spends in school. So even if some people who spent many years in school are no more educated than others, are they more likely to commit crimes than those other people? No, not according to the passage. C, the majority of people who do not complete high school do not become involved in any significant criminal activity. This is not really the people we're talking about. We are talking about heightened likelihood of engaging in criminal activity. That does not require that it be the majority of people. I would not say that 50% or more of most groups of people are particularly likely to become involved in criminal activity. So this goes too far and also not in a direction that is helpful for disproving this particular possibility. D, states that increase the number of years people are legally required to attend school saw reduced levels of criminal activity from the people who therefore attended school for more years. So, states that increase the number of mandatory years of attending school still saw reduced levels of criminal activity. These are not people that are going to school because they are more motivated to pursue education. They're just going to school because it's a legal requirement. So their motivation for that is not at play here, and yet they are still less likely to commit crimes. So that is one way that if we take away the cause, the proposed cause, motivation to pursue education, do we still see the effect? Yes, we do. Therefore, that is a reason to discount this possibility. And E, the percentage of college graduates who become involved in crime is even lower than the percentage of high school graduates who become involved in crime. This is also just a restatement of sentence one, like choice A. It's just saying these people who went to school even longer saw an even lower percentage of people become involved in crime, but we already know that there's a negative correlation, so that is not particularly helpful for us. So I believe it was D. Any questions about that one? So this answer is kind of awkwardly phrased. That's a good point. I think what it's saying is states that increase the number of years people are legally required to attend school saw reduced levels of criminal activity, specifically from the people who therefore attended school for more years. So they're saying, like, not only is this a legal requirement, but we're talking about the people that followed it. So if it just said states that increase the number of years people are legally required to attend school, you might read it and think, like, hey, not everyone does what the law asks them to do. That's very much in the vein of this question. We're talking about people that aren't following the law. So I think they tacked that on to, like, make it clear that it this is both a legal requirement and there are people following it, and those are the people that we were looking at. But yes, it does make it a little bit awkward. I would say sometimes GMAT questions kind of insist upon themselves in this way that is very strange to read, but it's to do that. It's to remove some ambiguity. Does that make sense? Or are there any other questions about this one? Let's look at this one. In general, the greater the number of versions of a particular type of item a customer is offered, the smaller are the differences between versions, and the greater is the likelihood that the consumer will be able to choose a version well suited to that particular consumer. However, because much of the satisfaction a customer derives from choosing an item comes from the sorry, I'm saying customer and consumer. However, because much of the satisfaction a consumer derives from choosing an item comes from the consumers believing that the version chosen is clearly the best version for that consumer. In many cases, consumers offered greater numbers of versions of items blank. A lot of the satisfaction a consumer derives from choosing a particular item comes from them believing that their selected version is clearly the best for them. So the more versions are available, the higher the likelihood that someone will get like a really good match, like a perfect fit instead of like a serviceable item. But a lot of the satisfaction a consumer derives comes from the fact that the item that they picked is clearly the best item for them. So when there's less variance, perhaps that confidence wanes a bit. Let's go through our choices. A. Consumers offered greater numbers of versions of items become so overwhelmed that they do not purchase any of the versions. Notice that we're talking about how satisfied or unsatisfied the consumers are. Overwhelm is an adjacent but different issue. So this one just veers a little bit in the wrong direction for it to apply. B, have difficulty choosing between versions that do not have pronounced differences between them. This kind of has a similar problem. We don't, it's probably true that the less variance there are between different versions of an item, the more difficult it is to choose between them. But to say from the passage that people have difficulty choosing between versions that do not have pronounced differences is a little bit of a stretch because we don't know that the versions don't have pronounced differences. Like it could be the case that there used to be two brands of oatmeal and now there's three, but they are all very different. They just have less variance between the different versions. So it still might not be that difficult to choose. This one goes a little bit too far. C, do indeed choose versions well suited to their needs. This one would be okay, except for the sentence that we're trying to complete starts with however. So it needs to contrast with the first part. Yes, there is this greater likelihood that the consumer will be able to choose a version well suited to themselves. However, because much of the satisfaction a consumer derives from choosing an item comes from the consumers believing that they chose a good fit, if they just then do indeed choose a good fit, well, that doesn't make sense with however. It's not really like the narrative flow of the passage. D, are less satisfied with the choices they end up making than are consumers who are offered fewer versions with bigger differences between versions. Here we go. We're talking about satisfaction, how relatively satisfied consumers are, how much satisfaction they derive from choosing an item. If there are more choices and the choices are closer together, then it would make sense that the consumers are less satisfied with the choices they end up making because perhaps if there was only two choices, even though they would not have made as good of a choice as far as perfectly suiting their needs, they might very clearly have made the best choice from what was available. Whereas if there are more choices, they might get something that's a little bit better as far as suiting their needs, but it might be very close to a second thing, and they might have been like waffling between the two things, and so it's not as satisfying. Like they don't feel like they definitely made the best choice of the ones available, even if it was a better choice than it would have been if there was less options. And E, choose versions no better suited to their needs than are the versions they would have chosen had there been fewer versions from which to choose. This one almost like contradicts the passage, but it it's really not supported. We don't know that they're not choosing versions better suited to their needs. We don't know that they are. We just know that their likelihood of choosing a version that's better suited to their needs or well suited to their needs is higher the more versions are available. So our best choice is D. I think this is one where it's a little bit, a lot of the choices just go off a little bit in the wrong direction in a way that can be hard to see if you're not used to looking for that. Any questions about that one? Some consumers maintain that eating organically grown bananas can be little different from eating bananas grown using synthetic chemical pesticides. Since pesticide spray from banana plantations that use synthetic chemical pesticides often drifts onto bananas on plantations that use organic growing methods. Ironically, that this contamination occurs is just another reason blank. So, some claim that eating organically grown bananas is basically the same as eating conventionally grown bananas because the pesticides go from the conventional farms to the organic farms next door. Ironically, that this contamination occurs is just another reason to, oh, yes, we need an answer that makes it ironic. So let's look through our choices. Why there is little need to be concerned about health effects of eating bananas grown using synthetic chemical pesticides since bananas' thick skins keep pesticides from the part people eat. One, this would not be ironic. And two, this is introducing new information, and we don't usually want to do that with a complete the passage. We're trying to wrap the passage up. We're not trying to add more stuff, like about how pesticides on bananas work. B, to be concerned about the health of people involved in growing bananas, both on plantations that use synthetic chemical pesticides and on plantations that use organic methods. Morally, should we be concerned about these people? Yes. Logically, no. Those are not the people that we are talking about. We are talking about banana consumers and whether these people who argue that eating organically grown bananas can be little different from eating bananas that are grown conventionally are right or not. C is just another reason for purchasing organically grown bananas, as the greater the percentage of bananas grown organically, the lower will be the amounts of drifting synthetic chemical pesticides. So, if people are buying organic bananas, even if they got some pesticides on them, these people are supporting the organic banana farms. So, because the pesticides drift from plantations that use synthetic chemicals to organic plantations, if there are less plantations that use synthetic chemical pesticides, there is less pesticides overall that can be drifting onto the organic bananas. So even though there might not be a difference when you're purchasing organic bananas and eating them, you could contribute to more organic bananas overall, which means you would be lowering the risk that your organic bananas have pesticides on them, which is how C ironically points out a flaw in this argument. D, just another reason that runoff of synthetic chemical pesticides from banana plantations can be found in waterways long after the pesticides were sprayed on the bananas. That is not ironic. That just seems like something you would expect. And E, why a label certifying that a food was grown organically never means anything. A little bit dramatic, a little bit of an extreme phrasing, but also not ironic. So C offers an answer that meets the irony condition. Any questions about that one? I have one more, and then we can do Q&A. Do most of the answer choices solely depend on the transition word into the missing piece of the passage? Solely, no. Heavily, yes. The transition word is usually pretty important as far as like framing the information that you're looking for, but it's not the only thing because it's also based on like the content of the passage. You don't want to be bringing out new information or taking it in a direction that hasn't been covered. But yes, the transition word is very important. Investment analysts. Our team has devised an investment strategy that is ready for implementation. To assess its impact on portfolio returns, we will closely monitor its initial performance. Regardless of whether the strategy proves successful, we may make adjustments to maximize returns. If the results fall short, we will engage an external consultant for alternative insights into adjustments we can make. By remaining adaptable and open-minded, we strive to optimize our investment strategies for long-term success. This one is very info dumpy to me. So one thing that I would look at if you see a passage like this is there's a lot going on how can you split the information into categories? And for me, the best way is by specificity here. So like a lot of these things are, they may or may not happen, or it's unclear. They're not like conditional on a result. We are looking, our sentence is after the initial implementation of the strategy is complete, if the company blank one, then it must also be the case that the company blank two. So if the company does something, it must also be the case that the company had some other experience. So we're looking for something that like is a triggered event to me. And I think I have that spelled out a little bit. So this is an if-then statement. We're looking for if P, then Q, or if not Q, then not P. That's sort of a set of answers. So here is some of like ranked by specificity parts of the passage. So to assess impact, we will closely monitor initial performance. They are doing that regardless. They may make adjustments regardless of whether the strategy proves successful. If it does prove successful, they reserve the right to make adjustments. If it doesn't prove successful, they still reserve the right to make adjustments. They may make some adjustments. They will engage an external consultant if the results fall short. That is a conditional statement. And by remaining adaptable and open-minded, we strive to optimize our investment strategies for long-term success. So they're trying to optimize for long-term success regardless of whether this strategy works out or not. There's no thing in this strategy that would make it so they weren't trying to strive for long-term success. And they are remaining adaptable and open-minded regardless of how this strategy performs. Let's look at our answers. After the initial implementation of the strategy is complete, if the company evaluates the strategy's initial performance, then it must also be the case that the company blank. So they're evaluating the strategy's initial performance regardless. So that one isn't a great fit for a conditional. B, if the company makes adjustments, then it must also be the case that the company blanks. They may or may not make adjustments if the results, or sorry, regardless of whether the strategy proves successful, they may make adjustments to maximize returns. So we don't know what situation where they would definitely make adjustments. D, does not strive to optimize strategies for long-term success. As I mentioned, there is no situation where they are not trying to optimize strategies for long-term success. No one wants short-term success and doesn't care about long-term success, typically. D, if the company does not believe that the results fell short, then it must also be the case that the company blank. So that one doesn't work for this part because we are looking for the then. If the company does X, then it must be because Y happened. So E, if the company does not engage an external consultant, then it must also be the case that the company does not believe the results fall short. We know that if the results fall short, that they will engage an external consultant. So if they don't engage an external consultant, then it must be the case that the company does not believe that the results fell short. Because if they did believe the results fell short, they would engage an external consultant. So this is a common issue. Why don't they work in reverse? If the company does not believe that the results fell short, then it must also be the case that the company does not engage an external consultant. We don't know that. We know that if the results fall short, they will engage an external consultant. But we don't know that if the results don't fall short, that they won't. So they definitely 100% will engage an external consultant if the results fall short, but they may still engage an external consultant even if the results don't fall short. There's no comment on that. It's only restrictive in this direction. If this thing happens, it triggers the second event. If you flip it, then it doesn't match. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Does a tree diagram work better in more cases like these? So it can help sometimes. I personally like to scribble down a diagram in a lot of cases simply because to put it into words is cumbersome and time consuming, and a diagram is just like a little bit quicker and it helps me more easily visualize. So if you like the tree diagram, then this is a pretty good fit for that. Any other questions? And the slides, if you will email me, then I can. Oh, can you explain what a tree diagram is? Okay, let me see. Hold on. Let me see if I can find like an example. Because I know that you know what it is. It's just like, oh, these are terrible. So it's like this. It's like, hey, if this thing happens, then what? And then if this thing happens, then what? And then those are the paths. So you would do probably like a pretty bare bones one for this. I would say that it's not so much that I don't write down the words, it's that sometimes with questions to summarize it like in words is more tedious than to just do like a diagram like that really quickly. It depends. Sometimes a visual is just like a quicker way to summarize my thoughts as far as taking notes. So I definitely recommend that you experiment with some different ways to take notes because you're against the clock. So sometimes some things will work better in some situations, and it's good to have a little practice with that sort of thing in case you would like to employ it. Any other questions about that or anything else? Would I say like the virtual whiteboard? I typically use my notebook just because that's what I mostly practice on. But I honestly think that the virtual whiteboard would be quicker to type on. That's just not how I ended up practicing. So I'm more in the habit of using my notebook and like a erasable pen. So I didn't end up familiarizing myself with the virtual whiteboard very much. And in hindsight, that might have been a little bit easier. And so I would just really recommend you check both out and see. It's probably not going to be super useful for quant. It sounds really annoying for that, but for verbal, you can type into it. That seems like a huge time saver. And I took the test in person, not online. Awesome. Any other questions? It's supposed to go up on YouTube, but if you will email me at that email, it takes like a couple of days and sometimes like a couple of business days. I know sometimes they post it on Monday. So if you email me at that email, I can send you the link once it's up. Any other questions? Yeah, what's up? It's really just for a specific type of verbal question, like this one, where it's saying, hey, this. If this happens, then we'll do this. If this happens, then we may do this. It can kind of help you see how specific the choices are in a different way. Whereas I was doing it just typed out. So someone asked if they could use a tree diagram, and I think that that's a good question for that sort of thing, but it would not work for most verbal questions. They would not be tree diagram friendly. All right. If you have any other questions, I'll hang out for a minute. If you want to ask me in my email, feel free to email me. Or if you want to reach out about the slides or the webinar recording, then you can reach out to me on my email and I can send it to you. Okay. Thank you all so much. I will probably. Are there any key indicators to know what type of approach, whether tree or verbal, would work best just from reading the question? It's more about how it would be easiest to organize the information. So specifically with that last question, because of the way it was a plan with like multiple steps and conditions, that's why I think someone was like, hey, would a tree diagram work for this? And yes, absolutely. Sometimes a different like chart can be helpful just to help you visualize what specific group or subgroup people are talking about, because that can be kind of confusing. There's definitely a question I was looking at recently where that was the problem, but I cannot remember which one it was. So I guess there's no clear-cut way, but you can kind of practice reading the questions and thinking about different ways to visualize the information and maybe play with doing some little charts. Can you share your thoughts on moving from a 60 percentile to a 90? Um, so that is quite a jump. I think that the biggest thing for moving to any really like high score on any of the sections is that you're going to have to practice until your accuracy is just basically flawless. Like you've got to be getting like 90, 95, 100% of questions correct, untimed. And then you can worry about your timing, and that will also be kind of a journey to cut down timing. But yeah, the first step of any big, like high score goal, or really any improvement, is focusing on accuracy. But if you're going for like a really, really high score, then you're going to want your accuracy to be almost perfect. And you should practice for sure easy, medium, and hard questions, because hard questions are hard and you only practice on them. But if you end up missing an easy question, it tends to penalize you more than missing a hard question, just because the test kind of expects you to get easy questions, right? And so you don't want to practice just at one level, and you want to get your accuracy really, really high. You have to develop your accuracy, I think, before you can worry about speed, because when you start worrying about speed, it limits how much more accurate you can get. So you have to have your accuracy foundation before you can worry about cutting down time. And then as you cut down time, sometimes you'll sacrifice some accuracy for that, and the balance will be different for everyone depending on their goals. But if you try to worry too much about timing up front, you will just never be able to hit that 100% accuracy, because the timer lets you off the hook. You know, you hit 2 minutes or you hit 2.5 minutes, whatever your timer is, and that can give you some permission mentally to like check out when the timer is reached, and that makes it really hard to hit the accuracy. But if you develop the accuracy first, if you solved, 200 questions correctly, then you go into timing and work on cutting down your timing. You have more control as far as the trade-off between accuracy and timing. So yeah, absolutely start with untimed practice. For sure. Yeah, feel free to email me if you have any other questions. Awesome. Thank you all, and hopefully I will see you next week. Instead of taking down notes, would you recommend relying on our memory, visualizing the passage in our brain? You, it's a balance. You don't want to rely on your memory too much because your memory is not good. If it's anything like mine, it's just not that good. But I do think that visualizing how the information works can help you get a better feel for it, like make it more cohesive as like a narrative in your head. And it can also help you be sparing with your notes. So that's the other thing is I think that when you start taking notes, you have to take really careful notes. You don't know what's important until you've done it so many times that you're like, well, I never use this part. Um, and so when you start taking notes, you have to be really, really careful. You're kind of like going through the motions and you don't know what parts are going to be easy for you to remember, like what parts are going to be easy to glance back at and useful to you. And then as you interact with your own notes more, you can get a feel for like, this is what I can cut down. And that is also why sometimes graphs are just easier for me because it can be quicker to draw something sloppy really fast that only I have to interpret than to like write out 3 sentences worth of premises. So yeah, don't rely totally on your memory, but conceptualize the passages in a way that will help you maybe trim down some of your notes. Oh, could you please? Oh, so I do think that taking notes is really helpful. And I do think that when you start taking notes, you have to take really detailed notes because you don't know what details are going to be important to you. But as you take more notes, you can kind of trim the notes down and make them a bit more efficient, develop a shorthand that works for you, that's easy to scan when you look back at it, and that sort of thing. Any other questions? It depends for your timeline. Um, so let me see. The higher you want your final score to be, the more time it will take for the climb. And then the other thing is what kind of things are keeping you at your 595? Is it because you need to learn some concepts, like you don't know how to do some types of questions? Or is it because you do understand questions well and you have a good feel for the material, but you tend to read too quickly or miss important details or something like that. So if your mistakes are that you don't have the information, then you're going to have to brush up on the information. And that, depending on how much information you aren't familiar with, that can take quite a while. And if your mistakes are more like careless in nature, so you're pretty familiar with all the material, but you tend to rush through, then that could be a reasonably quick fix if you can figure out exactly what your problem is. Or it could take a while to break that habit depending on how ingrained it is. So it's really hard to give you an exact number of hours without knowing more about where you're coming from and like what kind of problems are keeping you where you're at versus where you're trying to get. Yeah, if you're unfamiliar with the material, then really the only way is to get familiar with the material. And that will, I mean, it depends a little bit on your learning pace and what stuff that you need to practice. But that one's typically a slightly slower process because you're not just breaking your bad habits, you have to like learn new stuff, and it takes a while. Sorry, Kay, what part did you miss? Oh, that proposed timelines are hard to give without more information on someone's specific situation because it could be due to, hey, I've never studied this type of question and it comes up a lot, or I've never studied these three types of questions that come up a lot. But I'm really, really good at everything else. Like I'm flawless at everything else, but I don't know those three things. Then you just have to learn those three things. And that can take some time versus if you're pretty familiar with the material already and you're pretty comfortable, but you just have like some bad test taking habits. Like you tend to rush through things, you tend to miss words, you tend to be anxious in some way that is distracting. That can sometimes be a little bit quicker to fix just because you have to figure out your problem and then you just have to unlearn that behavior. And I say it can be quicker to fix. Sometimes it still takes a while to fix. It really depends on how deeply ingrained the problem is and how well you're able to identify what the problem is. Normally, TTP course asks you to follow the timeline, even if that means learning new material. Do you think it's a good idea to learn the material a little bit faster so you have more time to practice? I plan on taking the exam in 4 to 6 months. So if you, it's hard to say, do I think it would be better to learn the material faster so you have more time to practice? Because I guess I assume that you're probably learning it at the speed that you learn things, whatever that means for you. And so I guess learning material faster doesn't seem like a quick fix to me. Wouldn't you just be learning it faster? But you do want to leave yourself some time to practice. So I would plan at least for like the last, if you're going to take it in 6 months, to have the last like 6-ish weeks to do practice tests. If you're going to take it in 4 months, maybe the last like 4 or 5 weeks. You don't want to have the course part where you're learning the material go all the way because you are going to want some time for review so that you can figure out any gaps that you need to go back over. Yeah, it's all relative. It really is. I could give you some kind of general advice. And you guys are also welcome to reach out to me via email and just kind of give me more information on your situation. And we can maybe look at something a bit more specific. But usually I'll have to ask you some questions about the types of struggles that you're having, and then we can kind of look at ways to overcome those particular struggles and see if that doesn't improve your performance. Okay. Anything else? Perfect. Otherwise, I will probably see you all next week, if not the week after that, and we can do whatever's next. I will have to check my notes. Thank you all.